Okay, to welcome Susan Banki from Sociology at the University of Sydney. Susan's work is around art processes, diasporas and so on, and the topic for today is migrant artists and migrating art from Myanmar, expanding activism. Susan.
Thanks. I'd like to start. I want to acknowledge the indigenous peoples of the land on which I generally work, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I acknowledge it is land that has never been ceded. It always was, and it always will be Aboriginal land. And it's also land that has been held in custodianship far better by those that precede the white fellas that have come before that. I also want to acknowledge the lands of the country I study. The number of indigenous people are too many to mention, and the actual origins of many of those are obscured because of such a powerful architecture of colonialism, because of the long reach of Britain in this region of Southeast Asia that I work on. But I want to point to a number of indigenous people whose lands have been taken through colonial violence and whose indigenous knowledges have been ignored. These include the Shan, the Karen, the Karenni, the Mon, the Wa, the Chin, the Rohingya, and many more. So the violence enacted, that's my abstract. The violence enacted on the people of Myanmar over decades has spurred numerous forms of resistance against authoritarianism. Actors inside and outside the country have worked across borders to broadcast the government's abuses. A lot has been written about those actors engaging in traditional forms of activism, and here I point to the picture on the right, which is a report made by female human rights activists about the rape of Shan women in Myanmar. In recent years, though, there has also been a growing focus on less traditional forms of activism directed toward Myanmar, including photographs and performances, hip-hop, art of various mediums. Subjects of such art are as diverse as their messages, excoriating perpetrators and historical figures and the international community, indeed, as an accomplice. Women inside the country have deployed a new form of gender politics to shame the military. This is the tamain, which is the traditional female equivalent of the longi, which is considered so detestable because it touches female parts that military refused to go near it. So they would hang it across the tops of the street so that the military could not walk under it. So this paper builds on the literature of the transnational activism movement against Myanmar, focusing on artwork produced by Myanmar's transnational artists. Now, I call this work migrating art for its ability to cross both spatial and temporal boundaries, sometimes even before the artists themselves have. And I like to argue that migrating art is a site of expanding activism through processes that enlarge interested audiences and facilitate more pathways to send resources home to countries in crisis. And further, along with moving beyond spatial boundaries, as all transnational projects do, migrating art expands temporal boundaries. That's the idea. That's the argument. If he forces me to sit down right now, you have the whole thing. I'm going to not do all of the literature because I think I'm in a room of people that know this far better than I do, but these are the literatures that I cover in my writing up, the different kinds of ways that art serves as rules in social justice. Happy to come back to these if you want. So we know that migrating art, and this is an example here of one of the most famous artists that has migrated due to their art. We see some of the ways in which one challenges traditional cultures at home and also kind of the structures that, that globalization, neoliberalism, capitalism have imbued on those cultures. So I'm going to just jump right ahead into the Myanmar part in the fear of being hooked off the stage. So I'm going to just do the parts of relevance in Myanmar's context. I, of course, write about this far more in the work that I'm doing. So while Myanmar's 2021 coup sparked international attention for its brutality, the country has been in a crisis of governance since its colonial days. There was a brief post-independence flirtation with democracy from 1948 to 1962, which ended when the military, led by General Ne Win, enacted a coup. I jump ahead now to the 1988 student protest, which was met with violent reprisals by the junta. And without warning, in 1990, the government held free elections, much to everyone's surprise. And the anti-junta National League for Democracy won a sweeping victory. The NLD, however, and its most famous leader that you've all heard of, Aung San Suu Kyi, was not permitted to take power. The country remained firmly in the vise of the military until 2011, when, to the surprise of the international community, the military began what appeared to be a genuine process of handing over power. Political and economic reforms were followed by the 2015 elections, in which the NLD won a sweeping victory, and Aung San Suu Kyi became the de facto leader of the country. There were some troubling signs. I must say, I wrote about them. I'm sad to say I was right, that the country was perhaps engaging in some cosmetic and not real reforms. This ended up, of course, being the case in February 2021, when the military once again took full control of the country. That's Myanmar in a minute. Pretty embarrassing. So I now offer a social semiotic analysis of two of the artists in two exhibits that took place at 16 Albemarle, an art gallery in Newtown. The names of the exhibits were Fighting Fear and It Goes Without Saying. So during these Myanmar exhibits, hosted in May and June of 2021 and February and March of 2023, the gallery attracted at least three kind of types of viewers, of gallery goers: members of the Myanmar diaspora, those with a specific interest in Myanmar's human rights abuses, and as a corollary, those with expertise in activism and advocacy. During both exhibits, which I attended, circulating through the gallery's two rooms, one could hear people speaking in Burmese, and also, not that I speak them fluently, but I can hear the difference, some of the country's minority languages, Karen, I heard, and Shan. Conversations about the craft of the art, things like shading and perspective and the chosen artwork titles, for example, overlap with discussions about the political import of the works, such as the symbolism of certain colors and the inclusion of real and fictional characters as subjects. And the commingling not only of diverse populations, but of their ideas expands the Myanmar-aware audience and lends mobilization some political and some discursive weight. Activism was also expanded by the blunt instrument of what I call resource reciprocity, a form of transnational mobilization that sees resources returned to the home country. As related to artwork, this is what Jackie Adams termed solidarity flows, and I was going to ask a question about Chilean art, but we didn't have time. So this transnational mechanism ensures that the art doesn't simply benefit the viewer, enriched by a knowledge of a faraway conflict, or the distributor, enriched by the profits, but also the phenomenon that existed prior to the digital era, when Chilean peasants had their cloth artwork smuggled out of the country to be sold so the profits could be returned to them. In this more recent version of solidarity flows, artworks become transnational through the process of digitization and e-distribution, and the proceeds are then sent back to the artists, who benefit financially from exhibiting their work rather than the middleman. This process, as it pertains to Myanmar, has been described elsewhere, with the point that this particular form of financial remittance not only helps the artist and his or her close community, but attends to some of the problems of well-intentioned humanitarianism and advocacy. And I do want to just say that I actually buy work from these exhibits as a way of trying to do a little bit to remedy the fact that I acknowledge that even my being here is an extractive thing, where I analyze work by people that are suffering far more than I am. So my very small collective is at least to buy this art so that some of that money goes back. Okay, I'm going to just check on the time, which my phone stopped showing me. There we go. Okay, so the following artwork here examines the work of two artists from Myanmar who have produced it. Bart Was Not Here and Emily Theo. I'm just wondering, has anyone heard their names? I mean, it's so interesting to me because this, of course, speaks to the canonization of certain artists in certain places where the art is formed. They were not migrants at the start of their career. They made art during Myanmar's short period of openness, and it was, in fact, their art that produced their migrant status. So the young, I'm going to start with the first one. The young Myanmar street artist Bart Was Not Here uses temporality in his work in subversive ways to remind the viewer of his country's multiple and overlapping authoritarian eras. In Ne Win, the one on the right, one of Bart's most famous prints was showcased in Fighting Fear. The eponymous former military chief is featured saying, "I made that bitch famous." The phrase, already controversial in its origins, a lyric in Kanye West's song Famous, asserting West's claim on a right to have sex with Tay-Tay, takes on a very different meaning when spoken by Ne Wing, and presumably spoken about Myanmar's most famous political celebrity, Aung San Suu Kyi. The suggestion is not that Ne Wing wants to claim a sexual right over Aung San Suu Kyi's body, I don't think, but that ownership over one's body is a Foucauldian strike for political struggle. And further, the piece projects a form of political jiu-jitsu. It is as if the artist has Ne Wing say to Aung San Suu Kyi, "Your power comes from my power, and the system I installed. Without me, you would not have risen to fame." And Bart not here is exactly right about this. The piece, in commenting on the enduring power of Myanmar's generals, collapses time. Who are we meant to fear, and in what time period? Ne Wing was Myanmar's military general from 1962 to 1988, but then abdicated his position according to the logic of numerology. On 8/8/88, a time signature with import for both Ne Wing and for the 88 generation, that in response to a bloody crackdown on students and protesters spurred the first of the country's democracy protests in decades. Ne Wing appropriates a photograph of the leader that was taken in 1981 in the heyday of his dictatorship, wearing a Western suit and sporting a pair of, at the time, modern eyeglasses. Maybe modern still today? Itself a contradiction to his party's rejection of all things emanating from the West. He is smiling, it must be said rather creepily, and he looks a picture of health. This is not the Ne Wing who, along with his children, was put under house arrest later in life. No, Bart was not here has chosen a moment in time when his power matched the later power of Aung San Suu Kyi. In this way, Ne Wing disrupts temporal hierarchies. So the artist continues to play with time in work presented in the second Myanmar exhibit. So this second painting, The Birth of a Story, depicts a woman sitting in what appears at first to be a demure appearance, her legs tucked under her and to the side. A red flower is tucked under her ear, signaling a traditional pose, while a cherubic angel floats behind her. The setting of the painting in the woman's lily pad chair is a temporal marker of bygone years. As Bart was not here himself explained in the exhibition's notes, the painting calls to mind the cover of a 1973 periodical in Myanmar painted by a legendary artist. But the painting does an about face, snapping the viewer back to the present. The angel is holding a voodoo doll with the appearance of Min Aung Hlaing, who is the current architect of the coup. And the young woman in traditional pink costume holds, you probably can't see it, a dagger. As Bart was not here explains, the illustration is not an ode to peaceful pleasures, but to vengeance and war. Now I'm going to move to Emily Pio. I'm only going to cover two of the photographs here. So art operates on numerous temporal registers. Artwork may want to be timeless and timely, communicating messages that speak to numerous, timeless and timely, communicating messages that speak to multiple generations and to the here and now. There is the moment, long or short, of creation. There is the time of the subject and of the piece, and there is the period of its showing and viewing. While these three phases may not always be separated, their contraction into a shorter timeline has the potential to convey a certain urgency. This thing that is happening right now, which this artwork expresses right now, and you are seeing right now, is important. So as a photographer, Emily Pio has willfully pushes back against this time compression. Instead of using photography to plot time slowly, mark it abruptly, or imbricate its markers disjointedly. In 2015, well before the 2021 coup, Pio completed a series of 365 photographs, one for every day of the year, entitled Being 365. Following on this theme, post-coup, the artist created a daily photography series entitled Response 365. And several of these photographs were shown in the second exhibit. So in the photograph on the right, top right, Response 365, number 2022, Pio captured a massive street protest foregrounding her own hand held in a three-fingered salute. That was that Hunger Games kind of like mark to power. The very symbol of the now famous three-fingered salute, whose origins in a movie produced in the global north, Hunger Games, and then adopted in Hong Kong, Thailand, and now Myanmar, is an example of sociospatial disruption. While the salute is repeated and ritualized, it becomes what Dobson and McGlynn point to as the performance of contemporary activism. Caught in transnational spaces, such performances move in myriad directions at once, playing the dual role of protest art, where the provocation and witticism are visible in portable mediums such as signs and banners and the art object they write. So the in-your-face three fingers, front and center in the photograph, were made even more temporally relevant by the date etched in red ink that you cannot see on the artist's wrists, 22222021. Not only does this set of numbers bring the viewer to the precise date of the protest, but it serves as a powerful reminder of another set of practices that occurred in Myanmar, wherein demonstrators used bodily writing as a form of protection and protest at the same time. In writing their blood type and messages to loved ones on their arms, these streetgoers effectively differentiated themselves from a more mundane form of taking to the streets where one is not worried about being shot or never seeing a loved one again. Pio also created a longue durée photographic series that was showcased in the second exhibition. In Being Emily #1, the artist photographs her own feet on a plush gray carpet. This is after she's moved to Austin, Texas, wearing black socks with images of Rosie the Riveter, and juxtaposing the 70-year-old symbol of gender reversal roles that Rosie represents with the comforts of a modern world. Pio is placing the viewer in ambiguous time and space. Where are we exactly, and what is the time event that Rosie's muscular bicep is meant to oppose or support? Is this a call to arms against authoritarian fascism, as the original Normwell Rockwell figure clearly depicted? Or is this a nod to the civic duty that women undertook during World War II in replacing men in factory work? Or is it a parallel self-reflection about the civic work of contemporary Myanmar female artists to position them as a central part of the opposition movement? In either time or place, the photograph has the spunky tenor of Rosie's original motto: "We can do it." Can't really see them, can you? I can talk about this if you want in the question and answer. So the artworks of both of these cross spatial boundaries in ways that are quite obvious given their inclusion in traveling exhibitions. But inasmuch as these transnational artworks represent a means for communicating deliberate messages and meanings, a technology of semiosis, they do so in ways that are temporally significant. So following Kockelman and Bernstein, the choice to showcase past and current military leaders reminds viewers of the repetitive nature of events in Myanmar, calling to mind temporality as metricality. Similarly, the nods to the past, a riff on some traditional forms of art, depiction of old rulers, and in other examples of old dolls, combined with the refusal of these artists to accept an undesired future, exemplifies temporality as performance, in which each artwork, a performative symbolic sign, simultaneously points backwards and forwards in time. There are also markers for the viewer to identify the when of these artworks, i.e. the temporality of reckoning. From the date printed on Emily Pio's wrist to the post-Hunger Games three-fingered salute to the Min Aung Hlaing voodoo doll, these artworks are temporal signifiers par excellence, I would like to argue. So in conclusion, this paper has shown that in the aftermath of political crisis, art can produce the activist at the same time that the activism can produce the artist. In Myanmar, responses to many periods of repression, pre and post-coup, instigated forms of communication that rendered some material art and some subsequently turned the maker into an artist. At the same time, artists who heretofore never considered themselves activists became so through the portrayal of Myanmar's abuses, and the artists' respective oeuvres contributed to their makers' physical migration. That is, once their art was well known enough, it was not safe to remain inside Myanmar. Thus, the art not only produced the activists, but the activism produced the migrant. Migrating art and the artists that produce it play an unusual role in transnational mobilization, is my argument. The art itself becomes a site of expanding activism, reaching a broad and diverse audience. In two of the exhibitions examined here, the public commingling of politics and art brought several populations together. The art lover who, by happenstance, has now been exposed to Myanmar's crisis, the activist who witnessed the art as a form of documentation, and the Myanmar Watcher, who came for the political subject and stayed for the art. Migrating art also served as a way to shuttle resources for activism back home by producing those solidarity flows that channeled resources from sold artwork. In Myanmar, this meant artists received the profits from the sale of their artwork, which was either sent directly to Myanmar or to the artists elsewhere or to their communities. And I hope that this paper has shown that the Myanmar transnational art shown here challenges the status quo not only through a passage across international borders, but by crossing temporal ones. So I argue that the unsettling of time markers thus become an additional form of subversion and resistance.